Why, hello. It's Miss Gina, and you're at Miss Gina's Planet. You're just in time for story time. And it's 1/19/2024. And it was snowing this evening on me. So it was just spitting a little. I think it's about quit. Anyway, we left off in chapter 4 of The Mysterious Shrinking House. Well, chapter 4. 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4. So you remember there was a guy named Mr. Putt, some kind of television repairman that's being awful nosy. Let's read on. Chapter 4. Well, I declare, Mrs. Bright came to an abrupt stop at the end of the dark hall, one hand grasping Mindy's and the other holding open the door into the kitchen. Whatever! The kitchen was not dark. The kitchen, in fact, was washed with a half-light of dusk and open to all outdoors. 3 walls and the fireplace end, the side where the cupboards and the hall door stood, and the end that opened into the pantry were solid looking. But the missing 4th wall gave everything a make-believe look. Whatever has happened to the back door? Where's the back door? What happened? Mrs. Bright frowned. They will never do, she clucked. Mindy blinked in amazement and admiration. A tiny house burgeoned into a full-size house in a matter of moments, and though Mrs. Bright was concerned, she didn't seem in the least bewildered. A plump. That was what Mrs. Bright had, a plum. She might be surprised, but she did not flap. It was very reassuring. Even so, for a moment, the thought passed through Mindy's head that she was asleep and dreaming. I'm dreaming. I went to bed and all the cake is giving me dreams. Y'all have to forgive me. You know how Mr. Rogers puts on his sweater? Well, Miss Gina's going to take hers off. Phew. My heater is working. All right. I just came in from the cold. It's not that cold in here. Oh. One moment. I'll be back with you. Sorry about that. And on another side note while we're at it. Oh, wrong pillow. I got me this cutest little pillow. It says, stay a while. Stay a while. So, I needed some lumbar support. So, there we go. I'm going to scoot back and use it. So, let's get back into it. But she did not convince herself. Everything was too solid. She moved further into the kitchen to stare out into the littered yard. The barn had been splintered flat. The slat-back chair she held onto was real to the touch, worn smooth with use. Its seat covered with a cushion, a foot square. The cushion was still damp from yesterday's cleaning. Yesterday, when it had been, what, about an inch square? Lights shone in the Hallam house across the rose garden. Horace's deep bark sounded from his pen out back. I wonder why your father hasn't come out, Mrs. Bright said. That was such a dreadful noise. Surely he must have heard it. They're not here, Mindy explained. She was glad to have something ordinary to test her voice on. Even so, it squeaked a little. They were going up to Giorgiotti's for a while. Perhaps it's just a while, murmured the little old lady. I shouldn't be able to explain. I shall need to think a bit. I mean, it is lovely to have the dear old house back, but it's dreadfully embarrassing about your father's poor barn. To have the house back. Mindy was not perfectly sure that Mrs. Bright knew what she was talking about. To be back, something had to have been away. That makes sense. It's away, now it's back. Way back. Okay, got it. There. Mrs. Bright had not even known about the dollhouse before today, let alone a dollhouse that grew like a mushroom when you touched the front doorknob. Perhaps, she had been hit on the head by a falling roof tile or something. Yes, dear, back. The old lady had turned to rummage in a drawer of the cabinet beside the door. You see, it disappeared in 1915 while we were in California. No one saw it go, and there was nothing left when we returned but the basement. It's obvious what happened. It simply come back the way it went. Some sort of slippage in time and space, perhaps. I'm sure we shall find that there is a perfectly rational explanation. You mean it's truly your real house? Mindy faltered. And not a magical dollhouse? Tut, magic indeed. As if there weren't marvels enough without magic. Pictures, traveling by telephone, and men bouncing up and down on the moon, trees and flowers and children growing. They are your real marvels. This one has a perfectly simple explanation. I shouldn't wonder. Ah, here we are. Just where Mama always kept them. Mrs. Bright flourished a half-empty box of kitchen candles. And there are still some lucifers in the jar. Taking a match from a screw-top jar, Mrs. Bright struck it on a small square of sandpaper glued to a tin backing that said, "Strike here." That's helpful. And was fastened on the inside of the cabinet door. The match flared, the candle caught, then guttered until the lady found a candle holder and was a hand free with which to shield the flame. Let's keep that burning. Come along, dear. I must see everything. Oh, it's been so very long. And isn't this exciting? Mrs. Bright beckoned Mindy toward the hall door. In the doorway, she hesitated, turning to peer out again through the kitchen into the fast darkening garden. What I cannot understand is where that back wall can have gotten. She's got some good English. There were 2 windows and a door, most peculiar. Mindy gathered her wits. If Mrs. Bright thought such a happening was all quite natural, perhaps there really was nothing to get in a flap about. She fought down the urge to make run for the garden and tried very hard to sound matter-of-fact as she followed Mrs. Bright out into the hall. Daddy must have left the back off when he put the cleaned furniture in again, Mindy said. I hope it didn't get smashed in the explosion. I didn't see it out there. Mrs. Bright stopped with one foot on the bottom stair. In the candlelight, Mindy saw a faint frown wrinkle her forehead. Left the back off? What are you chattering about, child? You can't mean that your father tore the back off my poor old house just to have a peek in. That doesn't sound a bit like careful John Hallam. Oh, no, Mindy protested. You see, before it was well unshrunk, your house here was a dollhouse. At least it had a back that came off. Didn't you see how the whole thing was fastened on a board? Well, in the rear, there was a slot and a little catch thing to hold the back on. How could that be? Mrs. Bright backed up to the Windsor settee farther along the wall and sat down with a plump and an unhappy look. She set the candlestick down beside her. Now I'm mud. She's not mud. Now I'm muddled. Mindy, dear, I could understand a simple shrink and unshrink, or at least I could conceive of a shrink and an unshrink, not a dollhouse. It was strange enough to think back wall lost, but however could it come to have a back that hooks on? It makes no sense at all. Why, everything else is just as I remember it. This is the settee where I used to drop my school books, and that is the dear old Uncle Hezekiah. She patted the seat beside her and pointed with the other hand to a framed portrait drawn in charcoal hanging on the wall opposite. It was a stiff but kindly gentleman, excuse me, with mutton chop whiskers and a faintly cross-eyed look. Oh dear, it's got mutton chops. Mindy was saved from a poorly smothered giggle by the sudden return of Mrs. Bright's good spirits. Not to worry, she chirped. The house itself was too much for her to resist. Snatching up the candle once more, she pattered up the stairs with Mindy close at her heels. Mend the top step, dear. There's a snag where Papa caught his foot in the runner. The night the bat got in, and Papa went after it with a shotgun. Poor Papa. He was so dreadfully angry and looked so silly in his nightcap, blazing away indoors. The bat got away, and look! Yes, there it is. She's showing her a place on the wall. So there's another drawing, another picture. Are you trying to imagine in your head what this little dollhouse looks like? She held her light up and pointed high up on the rose-papered wall. A large patch of the wallpaper was pitted and torn, as if by discharge of buckshot at close range. A little sigh escaped Mrs. Bright. Dear Papa. That was the week before we left for San Francisco and the exposition. We called them expositions in those days, not world fairs, she explained as she bustled along the upper hall towards the front of the house. The Lincoln Highway was just new and we simply sailed along. We had a Kissel car. Fancy my remembering that. I wonder why they ever stopped making Kissel cars. Very comfortable it was. It was a lovely exposition. And did you know that the tracks for the San Francisco cable car were made right there, right up in Johnstown? That is, pushing open the door on her right, she beckoned Mindy in. It was a bedroom and a girl's bedroom, Mrs. Bright's own. Mindy guessed as she saw the dressing glass stuck around with faded photographs and programs and bits of ribbon and dried flowers pinned onto rosettes of paper lace. At Mrs. Bright's cottage next door, all of the mirrors were decorated with snapshots and clippings and greeting cards. Here the bed was a large four-poster bed with a canopy of embroidered linen. Golly, how neat. Has it got the kind of curtains you can pull shut? Mindy forgot everything in her excitement over the bed. She had always dreamed of having a tester bed or a cupboard bed. You could shut yourself up in your own cozy little world and let everything outside go on just as it wished without you. The curtains pulled smoothly along their rods on little wooden rings. How neat, she repeated. Mrs. Bright perched on the needlepoint covered stool in front of her old vanity table and sniffed sentimentally as she went through the faded and yellowed souvenirs so long ago tucked around the rim of her dressing glass of a mashed, and sadly crumbling wad of crepe paper, she murmured. My goodness, one of the nut cups, almost all made for the Christian Endeavor picnic supper at Findlay Park Lake. Alma's nut cups never changed, sad to say. At the last ladies' circle meeting, we had little May baskets just like this. Oh, she gasped. Oh, dear William, sweet William. She felt in her pocket for a handkerchief and dabbed at 2 tears rolling down her pink and wrinkled cheeks. It was a small card, picture postcard size, hand-painted in watercolors, but so warped and blurred that Mindy could not make out what the original picture might have been. Little Mrs. Bright dimpled and brushed a small hand through her white curls. Mr. Bright painted it, the sweetest birthday card I ever had. See here what it says across the bottom? To the sweetest flower of May. My name is Mary, but Mr. Bright always called me May. And this blur that looks like a wobbly green umbrella, was a Mayflower leaf. But down here where the flower and the little May apple bloom, he painted, dear me, let me think, yes, forget-me-nots and orange blossoms instead. I had so many bows. That dear William was very nervous about asking me to marry him. He sent me this as a sort of a hint, you see. Mindy made a polite noise that meant I bet it was pretty, and handed it back. How did it get all blurry like that? She asked. It fell in the lake, Mrs. Bright began. Oh, Ork, is this yours? Mindy broke into the old lady's remembering, her hand darting out to a rounded glass object on the vanity table. Where's it from? It was a pretty little paperweight of a lovely opaque blue glass with windows, round openings in the blue through which you looked into the clear glass to a colorful mushroom-shaped mound of brightly colored glass flowers. Millefori? Mindy's mother had explained that millefori, taken literally, meant 1,000 flowers, but really meant just such a cluster as this. The thin outer layer of blue glass must be the blue named after the king of Clichy, and the clump of blossoms could certainly be called a mushroom millefori center. Mindy blinked and wrenched her gaze away. It was almost as if she were about to fall, to float down through one of the windows in the blue. Float down through the clear, no longer solid glass to rest on that mound of scarlet and blue and yellow, not closely packed circlets of colored glass, but morning glories and glowing poppies. That is why dear Mr. Bright's little picture fell into the Findlay Park Lake. Mrs. Bright smoothed a bent corner of the old card as she told about the day of the picnic. This is going to be good, I can tell. That morning, it seemed the dreadful Willie Kurtz had come to call, and she, Miss Mary Buckle, had been trapped. Usually her mama or one of the cousins gave warning when his shiny mobile chugged into sight, so that Miss Mary had time to snatch up a novel to read before she slipped out into the orchard and up an apple tree. This time she was fairly caught. There was nothing to do but ask Willie Kurtz into the front parlor. It was awful. Refusing an offer of milk and cookies, he had straightway insisted that Miss Mary elope with him across the state line to Cumberland that very afternoon. "My little bus can make the trip in 2 hours, sweetie," he had said, smiling with all his teeth. "We'll have the knot tied and be back in time for supper with your folks." When the alarmed Miss Buckle had objected that she had to go to church picnic that afternoon, Wilhelm Kurtz had sneered, "Who cares about a passel of psalm-singing ninnies frisking around with shuttlecocks and canoes?" Miss Buckle had faltered and grasped at a straw. "But I am supposed to bring the baked beans and a sunshine cake," she said, and for some reason that had encouraged Mr. Kurtz. "I suppose," Mrs. Bright said thoughtfully, "it must have sounded a very half-hearted excuse. At any rate," he produced his little paperweight, very prettily done up in tissue paper and lace ribbon. "Do you know, it was so exquisite that I was very naughty and kept it." She kept it. I'm losing my glasses tonight. "It was very foolish of me." For poor old Willie Kurtz thought it meant that I had accepted him. I traipsed off to the picnic full of tender feelings for William Bright, with his dear birthday card tucked inside my bodice. But the pretty little glass flippery was weighting down my skirt pocket. "I was very young and silly," Mrs. Bright laughed. "Dear William proposed in a canoe on Findlay Lake, and I was utterly, perfectly happy, weeping away like a waterworks. Then, for lack of a hanky, I dried my tears on my shirt, and the paperweight rolled out and into the water. I quite lost my head and nearly tipped the canoe over. Fortunately, the water was shallow, or more would have been drenched than William's pretty sketch, but had to rescue it, and the glass ball, and very nearly me." He may imagine how furious Willie Kurtz was when he heard that I had accepted William Bright. My, but he sputtered. "Papa used to imitate him yelling, and here I was going to name my new machine after you. And Mary Kurtz Wart, the malignant growth reducer, the very best of all my medical machines. This one truly works. You shall regret this day. Miss Mary Buckle, wart reducer?" Mindy collapsed across the bed in a fit of giggles. "He must have been awfully gicky," she wheezed. "I'm not sure what gicky is, but he was strange. Even, yes, frightening. It may sound silly now. It was alarming at the time." Mindy frowned. "You know how you said all his teeth showed when he smiled, Mr. Putt? Mr. Putts do too. Do you suppose he could be your Mr. Kurtz?" She explained about Mr. Putt and the paperweight. "How odd. But no, he's far too young." Bright objected. "Willie Kurtz would be nearly 80. And your Mr. Putt didn't look a day over 50. She fell silent, then after a moment said thoughtfully, "Still, the house did disappear that very summer, while we were away. It was such a shock to everyone in Brittlesdale, such a mystery, that everyone avoided mentioning it at all. Now you see it, now you don't. Is very alarming on a large scale. The most polite thing hereabouts was to pretend it hadn't happened. The little old lady's musings were broken off by a rapid succession of loud noises that seemed to explode just outside the bedroom window. The roar of a badly muffled exhaust, crashing footsteps, and Horace's loud belly barking. His loud belly bark. The bark sounded closer and closer, strangely deep. "Now, how did he get out of his pen?" Mindy began. "He shouldn't be." At that moment, the house gave a violent lurch. There was a deafening clap of wood against wood, and the bedroom door flew open in a rush of air. The candle blew out. Most alarming of all was the sensation that followed. Mindy had felt it before, but that had been while going up in the very fast elevator in a tall Pittsburgh hotel. And now we are on chapter 5. Next time, chapter 5. We'll be on 5 next time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1 little fishy, 2 little fishies, 3 little fishies, 4 little fishies, 5 little fishies. We'll be on chapter 5 next time. See you next time. Grow your brains. And remember to read more in 2024. I hope you enjoyed this story. We'll be on chapter 5 next time. Bye-bye. See you next time.